Well, thanks ever so for joining us, and apologies for our slight delay. We had a couple of technical issues, but we hope we've resolved those. It's also amazing that we've got so many of you with us. I think I was putting our colleagues off earlier when I explained to them we had over 300 people now registered for this event. And in fact, it's a record for a Housing LIN happy hour. So congratulations to all of you, but it also shows the importance of this subject matter in the light of both fire safety, fire protection issues generally across our housing stock, but also in particular in relation to specialised housing. And today we're going to look at this in relation to both housing for people in later life, also known as extra care housing and sheltered housing, but also in relation to supported living. And we've got a fantastic cast of speakers for you who are going to give us some quick fire overview, very much from their professional and practical experience around fire safety and protection within a specialised housing context. We're going to kick off with Justin Bannister, who's a director at PRP Architects. PRP are working very closely at a very national level on issues around national guidance around fire safety and protection, who then going to be followed by Emma Atkinson, who's a building compliance manager at Ongo Homes up in Lincolnshire. North East Lincolnshire, if I remember rightly, and you're going to talk about some of the work you've been doing, some of the challenges and opportunities around new build and particular schemes that you've developed with Ongo Homes. She's going to be followed by John Foster, Director of Operational Risk and Development in Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing. John and I have had long conversations around issues around sheltered housing and also some of the challenges because of looking at compliance and retrofitting and what that means. And he's going to bring to us some of his practical experience and some of the strategic oversight that he provides at Metropolitan. And last but no means least, Helen Jones, the Fire Safety Manager at Green Square Accord. And you're going to look at this much more from a risk assessment perspective and some of the sort of impressive work that you've done across the group since you joined, having been in the fire service prior, I believe. So thanks ever so, all four of you, for joining us. And we also hope to be joined by Carl Sherwood in the Q&A session. He's a technical policy advisor in the building safety portfolio, with the building safety portfolio at the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. So we've got a really impressive cast, and without further ado, I'm hoping that Justin is still there and that we can share your slides. And over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, I'm still here. I've got some kind of a highly convoluted workaround involving a mobile phone, but you can hear me, so that's great, and I can see my slides, so I shall progress.
We got Justin's slides.
Yeah, Justin, would you like me to share your slides on your behalf? We can't see them on our side.
Can you not see them? Can you see them?
Not yet.
No. Shall I share them and you can just give me a nod when you'd like me to move on?
Yes, please. Yeah, because yeah, something's not working.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Let me just. There we go.
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Can you see those, Justin?
Yes, I can now. Yes, so yeah, my name is Justin Bannister. I'm in the PRP later living team. I've been working on specialist housing for many years, and I'm sort of going to give a bit of an overview on the architect's sort of view of specialist housing in terms of fire. Next slide, please. So like 20 years ago, I moved from a sort of a commercial architect's approach to PRP, and I had never been involved in the sector before. There was a lot of buildings with the name care in, and the first thing I asked was, what's the fire side of things for these kind of buildings? Having not been involved with them. Next slide, please. And so I could see we had extra care, and we had flats, and that was straightforward. But then there was communal and ancillary facilities for staff and residents and care and things like scooters. So that seemed like an extra element. Next, please. And comparing with care homes, Again, I could see the same communal facilities, but obviously we had bedrooms instead with ensuite. So that was a clear difference. Next slide, please. And so my new colleagues informed me that extra care was like flats, as dwellings, stay put in terms of fire, and building regs, ADB Volume 1 is where to look. But then they followed up with a little sort of, but there are extra things, other measures and things that you might need or might want. Next slide, please. And I could see that we had in ADB purpose group for flats and a purpose group where care homes sat very neatly. But in between, there was this grey area, which was housing, so flats, but with care. And with my sort of analytical sort of mind, I sort of rooted around, and I really couldn't see exactly where this was described in ADB. Next slide, please. And it's this sort of grey area, as I've kind of come to term it, that has caused confusion. I've certainly seen it in my own work, and confusion with others, including building control and other sort of professionals approaching extra care and sheltered and the like as if they're care homes. So very different in terms of management and the sort of resultant evacuation and compartmentation. So yeah, that confusion has been around a while. Next slide, please. But then looking closely, there are sort of little nuggets in ADB, the building regs, about management. And it's clear that management is an important thing, and it may affect your building, and it may be to do with resident needs, and it may mean things need to be done beyond what building regs ADB says. Next slide, please. And a little more as well on occupancy, so the residents and what needs they have, and maybe what range of risks are associated with their ability. But again, there's not really much said, but you know there's something to think about. And that this is probably beyond what you're seeing in the ADB guidance, which means you might need to look elsewhere. Next slide, please. But there are a few specifics in there. Not many, but some. Sheltered housing is mentioned. No other types of specialist housing, so quite limited in that sense. But there's reference to communal facilities being designed in the same manner as care homes, in a sense, in terms of ADB Volume 2, which is other buildings rather than dwellings. So there's an overlap there with care homes. References to reduced travel distances, but no specifics. Enhanced fire alarms too. Next slide, please. And then the other guidance. So where does one look? Well, these are some of the key documents, some of which are being revised, but where one is sort of directed in terms of filling these gaps potentially. And we, yeah, next slide, sorry, please. BS 9991, I suppose, is the one that initially one's directed towards from ADB, and it does describe far more the variety in terms of typologies that goes beyond sheltered, and it also lays out further measures. Next slide, please. And again, residents are mentioned, the characteristics of the residents, risks, and changing needs. Obviously, a population doesn't stand still, and people will age in place. And it also proposes design features. Next slide, please. And the person-centered aspect in terms of risks, probably the most detail in the NFCC guide on specialist housing, and they're the sort of central element in terms of the individuals and the risks, and then what that might mean for the building and management to respond to deal with those. and also more design features again proposed in there in that guide. Next slide, please. And then the regulatory reform order, again, in terms of occupation of the building and the requirements thereof. The thing with this is obviously this happens when the building's in use, so it's too late for designers. And if there's anything that comes out of this assessment, which is done when the building's finished, that you don't know about, then it won't be in the building. And it may well be an issue with the brigade and difficult amendments to the building. Next slide, please. So the kind of takeaway there is that the right people and the right processes need to occur in early design stage. Can't wait for designers' risk assessment, fire risk assessments, or a kind of a really thorough view of what the resident profile may be or might become. And it kind of impacts on who from the client team might be involved in the very early stages of a design to head off any potential issues in the future. Next slide, please. And within these guides, there are also areas where elements that are allowed in ADB are made clear that you shouldn't be using them in a strategy. And in many ways, they're quite logical. You shouldn't be relying on an escape window strategy or being able to crawl past the window with a fire in that window. Limitations on open plan and internal extended travel distances within flats too, and the issue of whether you can escape independently or not. Next slide, please. And then the features that are proposed within these documents, quite common to them all. Cross corridor extra doors, refuges in stairs, evacuation lifts, storage of safe storage of scooters in terms of and uplifts on fire and alarm and sprinklers. Next slide, please. In a little bit more detail, so the extra cross corridor doors, the idea is that they're to be within 7.5 meters of every flat front door, and essentially it creates a safe place relatively near to the flat for a resident to make it to, and be in what is a kind of a quasi compartment, much like a care home. So it's something that facilitates someone with difficulty who's decided to evacuate, even if it is a stay put policy, which it would be. People will still make their own decisions. Next slide, please. Similar again in terms of the effect it has on someone making an escape, as refuges and disabled refuge within a stair, maybe for more than one person, with a core point. And again, someone who's decided to escape rather than stay put, this will obviously facilitate that. Next slide, please. And again, all part of this kind of evacuation piece, fire evacuation list, which one wouldn't, at least up until now, normally had in flats. But these various guidances do point towards them should the risk be high enough, given the resident profile in specialist housing. Next slide, please. And the scooter protection element, protecting the escape routes, and obviously scooters also have been shown to be a source of quite powerful fires in themselves, and with the increasing use of scooters, which is seen, the safe storage of them would seem very logical, protected fire, and with the ease of fire brigade access to deal with fire. The next slide, please. So, in summary, what I'm kind of talking about here is timing. Really, is that there are a lot of processes which happen late in the day that revolve around management, operation, and resident needs and the profile of residents, and drawing those earlier into the process can really help in terms of design at an early stage to avoid costly and disruptive additions that later on. It's really about avoiding future problems, really, that rather than sort of following the ADB minimum approach, which sometimes I think happens. So yeah, thank you very much. Sorry about the stilted next slide, please stuff. Thank you.
Justin, thank you, and thanks for giving us an overview. And in fact, several of those documents that you've referenced, I know are hosted on the HousingLIN's webpage. We have a dedicated page looking at asset management in relation to specialist housing. I'm sure Sally can put the link up. But you've also set the scene very neatly to look at some of those practical experiences around new build, having sign-off arrangements, all those sort of things, as well as the issues around storage, egress, etc. So without further ado, Emma, I'm so pleased that you're able to join us, because I think Justin set you up beautifully. So
yeah, he did. Yeah, it did definitely set me up beautifully. Hello, everybody. I'm Emma Atkinson. I'm just trying to share my slides with you. I'm the building compliance manager for On Go Homes. Can everybody see my slides? Can somebody give me a thumbs up that I can see? Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about the extra care scheme that was opened last year, brand new build scheme, which obviously is flagship, and it's about kind of some of what Justin just discussed with us, how it practically happened, and kind of things that we did in relation to that. So in order to kind of talk about it in more detail, I did want to give you a bit of background to Myos House, which obviously may feed into what I will tell you further on my presentation. So hopefully, without further ado, you can see the next one. So obviously I went into Myos House, which is an extra care scheme, and what an extra care scheme was, obviously, and that it provides similar apartments to sheltered and retirement scheme housing, but it has care providers on site. Myos House also has a scheme manager who is on site, who deals with the day-to-day running of the building, kind of your fire alarm checks, organising activities for residents and everything else. As I said, it was a flagship scheme for us and North Lincolnshire Council. It was a joint venture to offer independent living to those suffering with dementia, and obviously have an on-site care provision provided by the local authority that would be available to those residents. We do have residents with varying levels of dementia. Some live alone, some have partners, families on site, and some use the care provision that's there, and some are actually not at the stage where they feel that the actual care provision is required. The ethos of the whole scheme was to provide a setting so that they could live a quality of life that enabled them to remain independent for as long as possible. And that was what was fed into the design of such. So just to give you a bit of information around it, it complied with the Housing Our Ageing Population Panel for Innovation, the HAPPI principles. Homes England and the local council, North Lincolnshire Council, provided some of the funding that went towards building this, and its official opening was the 3rd of September 2021. So obviously we're only in April 22, it is still a very new scheme. It contains 25 two-bedroom apartments which have their own kitchens, living rooms, bathroom, wet room. It's got 2 communal lounges. It benefits from 2 lifts. It's got a sun terrace, communal gardens which have got raised planters and seating, secure entry and a secure perimeter to the scheme, and obviously, as I said, staff available on site 24 hours a day. These are some pictures of the scheme, internal and external. It does look very nice, and I will say that. And there's some more pictures. So here on the bottom right picture, this is a memory box. One of these is outside every apartment, and it's for the person suffering with dementia to put something personal of theirs in to jog the memory that that is where they live in case they forget the apartment number or anything like that. And that was just one of the kind of extra things that were put in to cater specifically to the dementia kind of side of it. So I'm not going to go into that too much. I just thought visually it would be quite nice for some of you to actually see what it looks like about what I'm talking about. So who was involved? So here are the people that were involved in it. Helen is the top left hand side. She's the tenancy services manager. So obviously she manages all the tenancy services staff who feed into running the tenancies. And obviously running Mayos House. Georgie, who's on the right at the top right of picture, she was the development project manager, so she was involved from ongo in respect of actually getting the building off the ground and all the design issues that went into that. And there's many things I could talk to you about what's in Mayos House to cater to people with dementia, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today, so I won't go into that too much. And then obviously on the bottom picture, there's Lorraine, who's actually the team leader, and Mayos falls underneath her. Obviously, I've put up there GS Kelsey Constructions logo because they were actually the company that built Mayos, and North Lincolnshire Council obviously funded and provide the staff that work there. So I would just like to highlight that to everybody also. So challenges, this is the bit everybody wants to listen to. So this is a quote that I got from Georgie, so about the challenges of herself and the wider project team, that we actually didn't face many issues till we get near completion and everybody starts looking into it. There was, even though it was very clear from the planning permission stage, there's been issues at the end of what this building is, and people trying to push it into the care home kind of box, and that isn't what it is. And this is obviously quite clear from what Justin just spoke about there are differences between them all. So this is kind of where we've had issues with what actually is the building at the end, even though we felt we'd made it very clear from the start. So the learning that came from this was really kind of what Justin said: ensure that the authorities understand what the scheme is, because different legislation and guidance will apply. In this case, it was an extra care dementia scheme for independent living. It is not a care home. Something Justin also touched on about people understanding how the building will operate on a day-to-day basis. That is something that you need to have very early on in the building conception, because it creates issues at the end, because you're trying to explain to people how this building will be run. So even up at planning stage, look at who it's being built for and how that building will run on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, then you can start drafting your fire management procedures, and obviously you can get everybody involved in that and get people to see that as early as possible, to make comment on it from different authorities, which can iron out some of your problems at the end. And if there's no uptake from your authorities, all I would say is keep making contact with them and try and make them listen to you, that you want them involved from very early on in the process, because it will avoid delays and issues at completion. So learning from this, the joined up approach, get other teams involved. So this also touches on kind of what Justin said. With all projects, it's sometimes easy to be focused on what's trying to be achieved. However, other teams can input into this based on their specific knowledge and experience, and will be able to assist you. Also remember, if you are doing any new build or refurbishment projects, that once that project is finished, it's the other teams within your organizations that are responsible for then managing those buildings. So why not involve them earlier on? Because obviously they do all have their own knowledge and experience, and they will be able to give you some really beneficial advice and knowledge. So for example, getting your compliance teams involved, obviously they have the understanding of the legalities around the fire legislation, and they will be able to tell you how easy it is to manage that, what you're proposing to put in, or whether that would meet requirements. And they can obviously give you that information at the start, rather than it just meeting, you know, the bare minimum of approved document B. Obviously, as they manage the buildings, as they're handed over, or the refurbishment projects are finished, it is a really good idea to get them involved. And this is something that we have trialled at ongo, and it has worked really well. People have been able to feed into new things, and maybe give development teams something else to think about, rather than just what the actual project needs to be, obviously giving them other things to think about, and obviously it's worked really well. My examples of that is like fire alarm systems. So what fire alarm system you might be putting in on a refurb or a new build, it would be helpful for the compliance department to know what fire alarm system you're proposing, because as you know, some of them are open and closed systems. If the closed systems, only the installers can work on them. To get them opened up to open systems, it can cost a lot of money to change that over. And your compliance team, for example, would have been able to say, our contractor who manages our fire alarms can't work on that system, so can we look for another system, you know, things like that. So there is lots to think about at the start. In respect of your management procedures, again, ensure all parties who will be involved in the management of the building are consulted on this. This is both internally and externally. So externally, send it to, obviously, your local council and your fire brigade, and internally ensure you've got all the departments involved who will be responsible for carrying out the procedures that are actually written into that management documentation. Also, another learning thing from MIOS would be training, to ensure that all staff working within that building have the same training regardless of who they are employed by. So landlord, so On Go Homes in this case, may have given our staff one sort of training, and then North Lincolnshire Council, who were providing the care staff, may have given them a different kind of training. And it's really about just getting this joined up approach and making sure everybody that's managing the building has been trained the same on the systems, what's expected, the management of the building and everything, that it's all the same. And obviously any formal training that they need follows the same process, because it all relates to the same building. Additionally, this is just me pulling something from another scheme that we built a couple of years ago, about just checking that you're getting what you're asking for, because this was completed and signed off and it met obviously building control. However, it was discovered on handover day that the fire alarm that had been installed was not what we'd asked for. And it didn't match up with all the other schemes that we had. It wasn't the same system and that was requested at the start to match all the other schemes. Unfortunately, this resulted in a delay in it being occupied and additional works being required. So that really is just a point for me, if you're doing any refurbishment or new build work, just to check throughout the build that you are getting exactly what you asked for. So obviously you will see them installing a fire alarm, and obviously it may be expected that that is what you've asked for. So it would be my advice not to feel stupid and ask them what they're doing, but actually just double check that they are installing what you've asked them to install. So just to brighten the mood a bit, I just wanted to read you a quote about what people think of MIOS. This is a fantastic, lovely and peaceful place that On Go have created. It's going to help families, as those with dementia will be able to experience activities, mix with others and have people who they can relate to. The research On Go have done is fantastic and they have made the scheme look beautiful. As a woman whose mum has dementia, it is nice to know that there are people here that can be on hand at any time. So I know when I'm working, I don't have to worry. And that was a quote from one of our residents' daughters. That's the end of my presentation. Other things that I will just touch on, which I haven't put in my presentation, which was prompted from the last speaker, was in relation to this scheme, we actually did have a fire risk assessment done off plan initially before the building actually started being built, so that the fire risk assessors could raise any issues that they saw on the plans with us before a brick was actually laid. This was then followed up by a formal risk assessment when the building was made, and that was really beneficial because they did come to us with some queries that got ironed out before this was built. So that is an excellent thing to do if you do any kind of refurbishment or new builds, like for extra care schemes or retirement living, is if you can get a fire risk assessor that will do you an initial fire risk assessment off plan. It is a really, really useful exercise. And if anybody wants to know anything else about MIOS, then obviously I can be contacted. I wasn't responsible for building it and will not take the credit. Obviously, I manage the compliance team that run the compliance element of all the buildings that we own. So we feed into it that way. there was lots and lots of things that went into MIOS and why things were chosen and what safety equipment went in the flats in respect of sinks not being able to overflow and cookers turning off and everything else. And obviously that wasn't what I was here to talk about today, but if anybody has got any questions, then I'm happy to either answer them at the end or direct them to somebody who would be able to answer them for you. So I hope that wasn't death by PowerPoint, everybody, and thank you for listening to me today.
Emma, thank you. That was really, really helpful. And I think it followed on really beautifully from Justin's overview. So, and also giving those sort of practical examples. There have been some questions in the chat. We're inviting them to put them into the Q&A box. They may be more around the building regulation side of it. Do have a look, but we'll come back to it later. And perhaps also we might invite you and colleagues, or perhaps colleagues, to write a case study on MIOS House for the LIN at a later point, and we can showcase that in other ways. But that's really, really helpful. We're now also joined by Carl Sherwood, who's just joined us slightly late, and I will introduce him formally later on in the Q&A session, because I actually want to move on now to John. So welcome, John Foster from Metropolitan Thames Valley, and you're going to talk about your own experience working for a major organisation nationally around this area. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you see some slides? Yeah, thanks, Emma. Amazing. All right, so bear with me. My laptop decided to crash when I tried sharing screen when we were doing a quick dry run. So fingers crossed, I will stay with you and we'll see how we do. So yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. I suppose a very quick intro for those of you that don't know the organisation. So I mean, as we said, I'm John. I'm Director of Ops Risk for MTVH, and we're a kind of fairly large housing and care provider working across London and the South East, and then all the way up to the East Midlands and out to East Anglia, and kind of nudging a little bit into South Yorkshire as well. And I suppose the context that I'm kind of approaching this from is that as an organisation, we, like many other housing providers of our size, have got a lot kind of going on in the world in terms of the kind of building safety crisis, as I think it's kind of often called these days. So the cladding defects, everything that's kind of come through a lot of this work we've been doing in the years post Grenfell. And so with that in mind, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit today about, I think, what is sometimes a bit of a forgotten corner of the building safety crisis. And that is, as you can probably guess from the session we're in, when that kind of, meets specialised housing. Is it something we'd never really considered until about 18 months ago? But in those last 18 months, we've actually had 3 fairly major situations come up around building safety in the context of the wider crisis in our specialised housing, and quite a few sort of smaller kind of related incidents too. So I want to tell you quite quickly what those 3 examples were to start with, and then I'm going to try and share some reflections and thoughts on sort of what we've learned and where our thinking is off the back of that. So as I say, I'll start with 3 examples and hopefully I can move a slide on. Excellent. So the first one of these that I wanted to talk about, and this is really what sort of kicked all of this off for us back in sort of tail end of 2020. This was a extra care scheme, 50 flats, but part of a much larger overall development. So alongside that 50 unit extra care service, there are 2 additional cores of leasehold properties, about 60 or 70 of those in total, and 2 rows of townhouses or street properties, really, all within the building envelope, which is a phrase I've unfortunately become very familiar with, but in layman's terms basically just means within the same overall building. So quite a large site altogether, not hugely old still. You know, you look at it, you'd still kind of in your mind call it a new build. And I suppose the other bit of background that's worth knowing, particularly on this kind of forum, is that when we describe it as extra care, it's probably what I would describe as extra care with a small e and a small c. So really we're talking about independent living accommodation with a sort of dom care offer based on site, rather than a sort of full extra care offer that you might find in something a little bit more villagey. And in this particular service, MTVH, we own the building, own the whole site and provide the housing management, but then there's another organisation that have been commissioned to provide the care. So back in 2020, as I say, as part of an overall programme of intrusive surveys that we were undertaking across all of our blocks to identify any potential building safety issues, we opened up a couple of points in this scheme and discovered a number of quite major defects in the building. And each of those defects on their own right would have been a bit of a, well, quite a significant cause for concern. They were all fairly major, but we found 3 quite significant things all in this one building. And as many of you will be familiar with, your normal response to that kind of issue in a kind of non-specialist housing block, and indeed the action we took in the 2 leasehold cores of this building, is to put in place a simultaneous evacuation strategy in place of your standard stay put approach. And then you add in a bit of a waking watch and hopefully later on a fire alarm in order to facilitate that simultaneous evacuation happening. But you can't really do that when you've got a group of people in that building who wouldn't be able to evacuate on their own unassisted, which is what we found ourselves with, unsurprisingly, in a 50-unit extra care service that's designed, intended, and has been let to people with quite significant disabilities, particularly around physical and cognitive impairment. So the kind of customers Emma was just talking about in terms of dementia, that plays a huge role as well as physical disability. So you kind of find yourself, unfortunately, in, I think, what I describe as a pretty miserable place of knowing that you can no longer rely on your stay put policy because of the defects you've identified in the building, but you also can't effect a simultaneous evacuation within the kind of the guidance and the sort of window that you would need to facilitate that evacuation. So that leaves you in a pretty sticky position, and we took the decision within a few days of really understanding the extent of the challenges that we would need to do a full decant of that service and close it on a temporary basis as soon as we could. And as I said, this was in 2020, it was in November 2020. And so what that meant, and I'll let this sink in for a moment, is that we essentially had to turn around to the local authority and say that we were taking 100 beds, so that's the 50 that we were closing and 50 that we would need to decamp people into, 100 beds out of their extra care system pretty much overnight as we headed into the first winter of a respiratory pandemic. And for anyone who's not thinking, wow, that's a big deal, that's a big deal. There's not much worse news you could give to someone in that kind of system management kind of setting at that point, other than, you know, producing another wave of COVID, which we also then got a few weeks later. So that was a pretty difficult message to deliver and left us all as a kind of partnerships ourselves, the care provider, the local authority, everyone within that kind of wider care system in a slightly sticky position, but it was the only option we felt we had at that point. So we began the decamp process. It took us about 4 months in the end. And as I speak, really, the building's still closed. We have entered into negotiations with the original developer. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to start remediation work there fairly soon, and that we'll have the building back open again in the next couple of years. There's an awful lot I could tell you about that decamp process, and I'm happy to chat, as are the rest of the team, to anyone that's interested, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that now, so I will move on to the second example that I wanted to give you. And the second one is slightly shorter, I suppose, but this is about a learning disability service. So I think 5 units of supported living. And this is something where we are the care provider in a block that is managed and owned by another provider. And it was a slightly unusual situation that we kind of got a phone call one day, literally out of the blue, to say that there's been an issue identified with the building. And there was a missing, fairly critical, I think it's fair to say, component that hadn't been installed during the original build, that meant there were concerns over the ability of that overall structure to bear loads. And that sounds really concerning at first. And when we first heard that, we sort of said, well, okay, that sounds like we should panic a lot. How much should we be panicking? And the big message that we got back was, you know, it's generally fine. It's something we need to put right, but you'll be all right, providing it doesn't snow. That's the only real way that the amount of weight that would be on where this part should be would be so significant that it would be of concern. But this was December, and so it did snow. which was a little bit of a worry. I've never been quite so alarmed to see it snowing in the morning. I don't live that far away from the scheme, so there was a reasonable chance that if it was snowing out of my window, it was snowing on that building as well. But thankfully, it turned out, unlike the railway system that we all love in this country, we got the right type of snow, and it melted quickly enough, and the flakes weren't large enough to bond in the way that they apparently often do. And so most of that melted and came straight off the building, so we didn't need to worry, which was a relief. And after that, so a couple of months after the kind of the panicked morning of snow and kind of, you know, reaching for leaf blowers and brushes and things and trying to work out if we could get on the roof, the remedial work started, and we were able to keep most of our customers in situ. The few that we did have to move, we were able to do so really successfully with minimal disruption, because we had the strength of relationships across the kind of the network around those customers and the wider system. And so then finally, and I suppose most of interest, particularly for me at the moment, because it's still ongoing, is to talk about another extra care service, really similar to the first one, slightly smaller though, only 30 units, 25 of which were occupied, where we found similarly significant but different defects in this building. So as part of that same overall kind of programme of intrusive surveys, about a year later, we moved on to this building, which actually isn't far away from the first one, and began to look at that. And as I say, that identified a number of defects. But on this occasion, we decided not to decamp the building, and we decided to keep everyone kind of living who is there now, keep them kind of in situ and still living in that building. And I suppose that really was a different decision for us, because you know, we'd learned a bit from the experience of that first block, and also there were quite a few different elements, I suppose, to this particular scheme that meant we felt we could safely keep people where they were on balance. And I use the word balance deliberately, because it will always be in these situations a really difficult balance, where you essentially need to weigh up the risk from a fire occurring with the potential harm that would be caused from moving people. Because as I'm sure lots of you will know, you know, if you've ever closed down a sheltered scheme or done any kind of large scale movement of people within specialised housing, that is not straightforward. But I suppose the things that I would pick out that made that a different decision is that this time we were in full control, well, not quite full control, but much more control of the timings of that process. So this building was slightly older than the first one, and the developer who had originally built it was no longer in business. So that meant we had no responsibility or scope to be going back to that original developer and negotiating with them either around the cost, the liability, or the carrying out of the remedial works. So we were in full control. We knew that if anything was going to happen, we'd be doing it ourselves, which meant we would be, as I say, reasonably in control of timing. We also knew quite early on that the remedial works needed, while significant, could actually be done whilst people were largely in situ. So there's a bit of moving around that we're having to do for people within the building and for kind of short periods. But actually, unlike the other service, we're not having to completely rebuild whole sections of that building, take up floors, walls and everything all at the same time. And it's a smaller service as well, with a number of voids that allow us, as I say, to do some internal moves. But the other significant one, which I think Emma and Justin have kind of touched on slightly already, is that we already had some significantly improved relationships, in particular with the London Fire Brigade in that area, so that we knew if we did need to undertake an evacuation in an emergency, we had a much better kind of relationship with them on how we would do that together and what that partnership would look like. So I suppose the point of all of this is really just to pick out a couple of reflections. And I don't think any of this is particularly groundbreaking. It's not adding a huge amount to what we've already talked about. But really the reason I wanted to talk to you all today was to try and get across, or try and begin, I suppose, a bit of a conversation around all of this. Because as I said right at the beginning, this isn't something we'd ever considered before. It's something that doesn't feel hugely talked about or understood or known in the sector. And that for me is a bit of a challenge. I think it's something we should be talking much more about. So the first kind of thing to pull out, and I suppose the biggest thing for me personally, was learning about the kind of complete gap, if because Justin was very polite in calling it a grey area, I think it's probably a gaping hole really in our regulatory framework, in particular for these kind of extra care type buildings. And I kind of use those inverted commas particularly because I think we don't have a shared definition of what extra care means, either from a building perspective or often from a service perspective either. You know, those of you involved in operational delivery or commissioning of these will have seen that model change and kind of meander, you know, sometimes for the better, sometimes not, depending on your perspective, since it really came into being those years ago. And I think that's had a real impact. So yeah, things would be very different, I think, if we had much clearer guidance on this. And what we also understood in terms of the guidance as well is that that gap, that grey area, doesn't just change or impact how a service is built and that initial development process, but crucially for us, it impacts on the shared understanding that you have over time. So we suddenly found ourselves all looking at this one building with, you know, my team, the operational care and support team, our asset teams, a fire engineer, a whole extra firm of fire engineers, people from the developers who have to oversee everything if they're kind of talking about liability, the local fire brigade, folk from the council, folk from the council's building team, who the social care team have brought in, all of these people suddenly looking at this one building. We didn't have a shared understanding between us of what that building was classed as from a regulatory point of view. And that makes not only conversations really difficult, but in my view, I think risks really undermining the decision-making process there, particularly if you're having to make decisions in a kind of, you know, pressurized circumstance like that. The second big thing to flag up, I suppose, is customers, so our residents, and the fact that they need to be at the center of all of those decisions. Part of the role that we found we had as an operational team was to kind of champion that internally, because, and again, this will be familiar to lots of you, it's very, very easy and completely understandable that it's very easy to, but it is easy to default to the building in these situations because, you know, you're looking at this great big thing that's sticking out at the ground that's causing you a headache. You suddenly do go very building focused, but fundamentally, people are a huge part of fire risk, right? Like the risk to a building is massively impacted by the people living there, and the risk to those people is massively impacted by the building. So any understanding of fire safety in a building isn't really complete or reliable unless it completely considers those people that live there. But I think the biggest question we're left with, and certainly the one that we're still grappling with, and I think will be for quite some time, is how much do you plan for these changes for a failure in the stay put policy, if, you know, stay put is indeed the right strategy for that building? Because we found ourselves very quickly realizing that we had a situation that was essentially, in most of these buildings, depending how you look at it, completely untenable in terms of the customers that we had living with the needs that they had and the type of building they were living in. But that is completely normal to have people with that level of need living in that type of building. And we'd kind of, I suppose, in good faith almost kind of gone with that as a sector, and I don't mean us necessarily as an organization, but the sector, the system, the wider thing has sort of followed through on that, and not necessarily, I don't think, questioned how much you need to plan for when things change. So, you know, actually, should we be reconsidering our nominations agreements with local authorities around the level of need for people that are going to be living above the ground floor? And, you know, an easy answer to that often is no, because you can put an evacuation lift in. Excellent. What if that evacuation lift breaks down? How much should we be planning for these eventualities in these circumstances? Because unfortunately, a really rare event where you might need to change your evacuation policy, or, you know, your lift goes out and is out for a long time because we've now also got a supply chain crisis that's got, you know, shows no signs of resolving itself. They're becoming much, much more frequent. And that's something in particular, the lift issue, that we're seeing, you know, come up much more in general needs accommodation now as well. It's something we're really struggling with in a number of buildings where, yes, we've got evac lifts, so we could be in a much worse position, but, you know, we're not able to get parts for them. And what is that offer then? And what is our responsibility, and what risk are we willing to take, or should we take, or should we put our residents under for people that are living in circumstances where they wouldn't be able to self-evacuate without that one critical bit of infrastructure? So lots and lots of questions that we're struggling with, and I suspect many of you also are too. But just to end on some positives, because that is all a little bit depressing if we dwell on it too much. That first service I mentioned where we had 50 units, so the kind of the bigger project in all of this, As we are going into remediation work on that, we are hoping, and we're about to go to planning for this, so fingers crossed, to take this opportunity to reconfigure the ground floor, which is very exciting. It was a truly bizarre design of a ground floor of an extra care scheme. I can say this because it wasn't a PRP scheme, but it was one of these ones where you walk in and you go, what on earth was someone thinking? So very exciting opportunity to sort that out and add in 3 units of new accommodation as well. And also on a more personal level for a lot of the customers, I say a lot, I think 5 or 6 in the end, that decamp process was actually a really good opportunity to move them to more appropriate accommodation. So we had a handful of people who either stepped up to more intensive accommodation that was more suitable for them, or used that opportunity to step down into sheltered as well, where they didn't need the care service. So some really good outcomes there as well. So yeah, that's me. Sorry, I think I've gone a little bit over time, but hopefully that's just some interesting examples of what we've been working on and some of what we're grappling with. So would love to hear kind of thoughts and comments in the chat and when we get to Q&A.
John, you'll see that you've actually stimulated quite a few questions and people
Okay.
who also are sharing their own similar experiences, and you've struck a chord with them about what they're going through as well. So do have a look, and we'll come back to the Q&A. But also, you sort of talked a lot about that risk assessment, and again, that's a really good segue to Helen, and you're going to sort of share your experience doing a major comprehensive risk assessment for Green Square Accord. Without further ado, please, I'll hand over to you. Please don't worry about the time, okay?
Hopefully I won't take too long. Can you see my screen and my
we can.
Slides up? Brilliant. So if I'm looking this way, that's because this is where my slides are. So do put questions in the Q&A. Really, it's a different kind of presentation for me. This is more a sharing of the work that we've been doing and what's happened for us over the last year. So as Jeremy kindly introduced me, I'm Helen. I'm the Fire Safety Manager at Green Square Accord. And I took up that position in late February, early March last year. And then by the time I'd completed my own e-learning, we merged to become Green Square Accord. So joined together 2 rather large housing associations and have been working ever since on fire safety and making that a Green Square Accord thing. So I'd just like to share with you a little bit about us. We merged in April 2021 and we currently have approximately 25,000 homes. 150 of those are in some kind of form of care and support, with 54,000 housing customers, 4,000 colleagues, and we deliver over 3 million years of care, hours of care every year. Our buildings range is really large and it goes from everything from purpose-built care facilities such as extra care or providing residential and supported living care. We've got some buildings that are listed, purpose-built blocks of flats and various ranges of houses in the middle of that. And our geographical reach is roughly from Newcastle to Salisbury. And we have an in-house design, construction and sales team with off-site manufacturing facilities producing timber framed homes. So a really large organisation now. And specialised housing. So we do have some residential care premises, but our specialised housing really is made up, as you can see, of an absolute mixture. 118 supported living premises currently, 76 plus sheltered housing schemes and 29 hostel accommodations with 9 extra care facilities at the moment. And we work with a number of different agencies delivering care and support in our buildings, including district councils, county councils and various care providers. So this is the story that I wanted to share with you really, and it'll be interesting to see if anyone else has had or been through a similar experience. But at Merge Point, last year, it became really clear that we had 2 different legacy organisations with a differing approach to fire risk assessment in general, and process following it really, which we needed to align. So one of our legacy organisations had an in-house team delivering their FRAs, and they'd always done it that way. And one used an external provider that was third-party certificated assessments through a UCAS accredited body. So it was really two very different ways of looking at fire risk assessment, but also more importantly, the way in which those fire risk assessments were managed and the actions that were arising from them. So we had to think of what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And our next step really was, we decided fairly quickly to risk assess the whole legacy organisation's applicable buildings using that external provider to provide a consistent approach across the business. And we went and completed care and support premises first. And the risk assessments were then undertaken by competent registered fire risk assessors, and the assessments are then held in a cloud risk-based management system. And that was really helpful because for a newly merged organisation, we're still in the process now of aligning our systems and our data and all of those bits and pieces. So to be able to hold the fire risk assessments on a cloud risk-based management system meant the whole organisation immediately were able to access that system, which was a real benefit for us. And you can see here I've put in the word competent in bold, and that's because I think that's a real, not buzzword, but a real topic in fire safety at the moment of competency around fire risk assessment. I'm sure many of you have been listening into the inquiry at Grenfell and watching developments in that area. There's been competency frameworks being discussed, and we really wanted that reassurance that our risk assessors were competent to undertake them, and we could get an external viewpoint really on our buildings, which was really quite important for us. So it worked very well. Each fire risk action is held individually within the cloud-based system and is given a time frame for completion, as you would expect. And that allows us to ensure the actions are managed effectively by reaching the right person or contractor directly from the system to ensure its action sufficiently, and then hold the evidence of that in that system. And each FRA is individually certificated. It follows the PAS 79 methodology, and that gives us the reassurance that it's suitable and sufficient. And you can see here, I've seen someone's already mentioned it in the comments, we're awaiting those changes. We know we've got the FIA technical guidance document at present, but I think everyone's eyes are on PAS 79 too at the moment also. And I just want to share with you why we think this was the right approach. It's been the right approach for us. Significant findings that we started to see coming out of those fire risk assessments, it was an unusual approach to take. Doing the whole of something again in a condensed period of time is not the ideal way of doing things, but we wanted to know our risk and get that consistency very quickly. So and that's enabled us to make some really good improvements quickly and really get a handle on what we need to do in the future. So now we understand much more quickly and efficiently our overall risk as an organisation, and it's allowed us to adopt best practice and move forwards consistently. And we're in, I'm not sure if any of you organisations already are, but we're in a primary authority scheme, and that's provided us with some really good, clear, consistent advice throughout this last year, because it has been hard going to push through that FRA programme this quickly. But it also allows us to adopt a consistent approach in other ways, which has been beneficial, particularly through going through a merger. And it's made sure that we look at our fire risk holistically for a building. So instead of having two separate FRA programs done in a separate way, in one place we've got it looking at the building, the physical buildings, the management of the buildings and the occupancy characteristics, which is really important when we're talking about specialised housing. And it's incorporated considerations for changes to existing and in the upcoming legislation, because obviously on top of us doing that over the last year, the Fire Safety Act has been coming in, and I think everybody's got an eye on the Building Safety Bill, which we have got some applicable in scope buildings for that too. And I just wanted to share with you some of the advantages for specialised housing that this has had. all of our buildings have been assessed with the correct applicable fire safety guidance and are consistent. And when I'm talking about guidance, I'm not just talking about purpose-built blocks of flats, building regs, and the specialised housing guidance, but also all the different British standards that that we work with within fire safety, that are technical guidance documents. So because we've got that consistency with the risk assessments, we've also got a consistency in approach to the way that the guidance is applied, which has really helped us over the last year. And all the fire risk remedial actions being held within one system has really helped as well, because we've been able to draw from that trends and themes of actions, which are really easily identifiable and allow us to make more strategic decisions. And also look at our provision of person-centred fire risk assessments through that cloud-based system, because we can clearly evidence all the buildings where that's being done in one place. And more importantly, as I've always said, it's not just about completing a fire risk assessment in principle. That what really matters is what comes out of your fire risk assessment. It's one thing having one, and it's another thing dealing with all of the things that they bring up. So as I was saying, we've now got that strategic management in place by doing it that way. So we're able to plan our projects, use it to inform our investment strategy, and also to procure contracts more effectively, because we've got all those actions coming through in quick succession. We can procure contracts based on the work that we're seeing come out of them, which has been really helpful. As you can imagine, the last year has been a challenge. It's been a big challenge for us. And I just wanted to share with you some of the very real challenges that we've got now. We've got through some, we're still going through others, but it has been quite a big thing. One of the big things in doing it this way has been concurrent timeframes running for fire risk remedial actions. So we're trying to balance a lot of work coming out of them. At the same time, as having merged as an organisation, it's also meant needing to align things like policies and procedures and things that you take for granted in an organisation. You know, we had some subtle but quite significant differences, such as training, and our policy on practical training for the use of fire extinguishers, for example, was different either side, and that meant there was different training needs for different parts of the organisation that we've had to consider. The other thing is, by merging and becoming that much geographically larger, we're then working with more care providers than either side was used to before. It wasn't so much a big deal for me, because I never knew anything differently, but we've had to adopt a kind of making sure that we still consider our buildings as they are in the areas that they are for the care providers that are occupying some of our buildings. We have buildings where we own the building, we're responsible for the fire risk assessment, but they're occupied by customers and their care providers predominantly. But we also have buildings where we own the building and it's our staff in delivering the care for those customers. So a multitude of situations, really. Procurement for specialist works. So when we've had works that we haven't had a contract in place for certain reasons in either legacy side of the organisation or the organisation as a whole, having to go out and procure that, we're obviously bound by procurement legislation as well, so that there's been a little bit of frustration around making sure we can get works done in line with timescales, but making sure we've got the right people in place to deliver that work and are abiding by all other applicable legislation. And as I was saying earlier, when you've got multiple actions in relation to similar themes or trends, we've had to develop programs of work that are then risk rated, and we submitted that back to our fire risk assessors, who then help us develop and work on programs of risk assessed work, which has been one of the biggest projects that we've had coming out of this fire risk assessment program. And I also wanted to share with you some of the works coming out of this have identified significant changes to a building and remedial works, such as the complete installation of AOVs, changes to internal layouts in some of our specialised housing, passive fire stopping and fire door works has been a huge theme as well, and I'm sure you're all aware, or maybe are having your own experiences of sourcing materials in connection with large projects at the moment, which has led to some delays. And also talk to you a little bit about the fire safety management side of things that we're seeing coming out of this. So as I've mentioned, aligning our training requirements, aligning even things as simple as routine testing and maintenance procedures. So how we do things, how often we do things, how we gather and keep evidence of that is something that we've had to run concurrently in the background to doing these FRAs. And also working with multiple care providers for us is a challenge, really, because we need to do the right things in the right buildings for the right reasons. But when you've got 2 or 3 different organisations all perhaps working in one building, such as Extra Care, and Emma already touched on it earlier, you want people to be doing things to the same standard in the same way, and certain care providers might have different policies. They might have, we've had a couple who've got just different approaches to us, so working with them to make sure that the right things are happening in those buildings and that the actions are getting addressed, but also respecting each other's different stances on elements of fire safety, and taking that into account and evidencing that through these actions has been something that we've been actively working on. And one of the really interesting things that's also come out of it is building tenure designations even have been a theme of these actions. So using consistent language and the correct applicable guidance has been something that's come out from the fire risk assessment process, i.e. we're calling something specialist support, and it will come out of the risk assessment as hostel accommodation. And as you all likely know, different fire safety guidance is applicable for different stuff. So making sure that the right guidance is being used and the right standards are being put in place in each building has been something that we've had to make sure is in place and review, and then discuss how we can use consistent language within our own company to reflect it. And also rolling out new teams and structures to support the wider organisation, because this has had quite a significant impact within Green Square Accord. So we've got some new teams, with undertaking recruitment campaigns to bring in more specialised support in terms of technical fire safety knowledge and other building safety knowledge. So we've got a new team of building safety officers that are now working to support our specialised housing staff really across the organisation, and also other care providers, so we can address actions and make sure that things are in place. So I just thought it'd be interesting to share with you some of our more significant findings from these risk assessments, so that you can see some of the things we've been doing. So we've had some significant findings that have kind of come out beyond the scope of a Type 1 FRA, in a room scenarios and other internal layout issues where we've had to visit some of our existing buildings and look at how we can overcome those situations, and in some cases redo internal layouts, in others put other mitigating measures in place. So that was a challenge as they've arisen. Making sure that whilst we're doing this work strategically as a wider, bigger organisation, that person-centred approach remains foremost, and making sure that those staff that are undertaking those person-centred fire risk assessments and supporting that work really understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, and the implications of it, and it's joined up within the organisation and other organisations to achieve the right results for the customers we're doing it for. Simple things, we had a significant number of actions in relation to items in means of escape, so something quite simple, but it involved reiterating policies and putting a lot of real man hours really into making sure that they were all removed, and that people understood the designs of buildings, particularly specialised housing, where it isn't always clear, and we do have some buildings which, you know, obviously more resemble a domestic home than they would a care facility. So staff understanding where things can and can't go, and what they can do was a big theme for us. Training, as I've said, that's reviewed right from the moment you walk in the door to green square accord from induction, and I'll share with you in a slide in a second a little bit more of the things we're doing there. And practical actions, we've had a few of those. So things like hard standing for external escape routes and making exit gates around our specialised housing more accessible and more easy to use for occupiers in those buildings has been one of the things that has arisen quite a lot. And I just thought I'd share with you a couple of the larger projects. I'll try and get through, if I'm going over, I'll try and get through it quickly, but I just wanted to share with you Booth House, which is a building that just keeps on giving, if I'm being honest with you. So it's a building that adjoins a travel lodge actually, and it is run by one of our, has a care provider with it in it. It's not quite care, it's more supported living. It has a simultaneous evacuation policy in place. And after the FRA, we initiated a passive fire safety project there, and looking at the actions that came out, we decided before we completed any remedial work, the best thing to do, we didn't have, because it was an existing building, we didn't have a fire strategy document in terms of the compartmentation. We just didn't have it. So we had to go and get one done, essentially. So we commissioned a company to come in and do that for us and produce us with a really detailed, informed fire strategy document, which took a little bit of extra time, but was well worth it, because once we had got that and got a full compartmentation survey undertaken as a result of that, some significant works were identified, and significant investment into that building was required in order to put it right. So what's really interesting is you can have one action or two actions come out of a fire risk assessment, and a massive project on the back of them to run as well, which has been quite an effort to get done in accordance with the timescales, particularly when you're running multiple projects at once, really. So that's being delivered in as we speak. And the other one I wanted to share with you, which is similar to Emma's example earlier, which goes to show exactly what she was saying, really, with regards to, and Justin earlier, with regards to fire risk assessment. So Brobrook is a 90-bed dementia scheme, fairly new built up in Bradley. And we noticed, we got the fire risk assessment done fairly swiftly. We had a pre-occupation one done, and then a fire risk assessment following occupation, and highlighted during the development of it, the specifications for emergency lighting had been to the British standard, and immediately on the fire risk assessment it was picked up that the external route, and I've just given you, this is just a snapshot of the emergency lighting calculations actually for the scheme. We picked up that the external route around the edge of the building to the assembly point had no external emergency lighting, or an insufficient amount to cover the external escape route. And we ended up having to take that back to the developers, who hadn't included external lighting in their lighting design. And yet we're saying it was to the British standard. So therein goes a debate, and we had to instruct to get the emergency lighting done to the British standard to include the external. And what you can see here are these little numbers, and this is the calculation. So we wanted to make sure that our external route was to a minimum of 1 lux all around, so that in the event of an evacuation in the dark for a 90-bed dementia scheme, you could see your way around to the assembly points. So it was a really important thing for us, and it was a surprise really to get that out of a fire risk assessment from a new development, because especially where your specification is to the British standard, and it just goes to show that little bit of detail and that knowledge of what's in the British standard goes a long way when you're getting fire risk assessment actions off the back of a new development, really. So I wanted to share that with you. And then I wanted to share a training project that in a little bit more detail that is relevant to specialised housing. So we've got a current project reviewing and aligning our fire safety training across Green Square Accord. And part of that actually is about our fire drills and ensuring that our fire drills include the practical use of evacuation equipment. So obviously you need training. If you've got evacuation equipment in place, you need to make sure there's staff that are expected to use it have had training in it. But what kind of hadn't really happened was the training in the use of that equipment to that individual building's evacuation plan. And we really want to make sure that our drills for our specialised housing, where staff are responsible in part or in full for the evacuation of some of our customers, their fire drills actually include using the equipment to the evacuation plan for that building, and they're realistic, timed correctly, and centred towards those who occupy the building, so that your staff are prepared for your worst case scenario in a really practical way, because everything else from then is only going to get easier. And the other thing we're doing off the back of that is further training to staff who are involved in completing PEEPs and person-centred fire risk assessments. So just to share, that's kind of where we are now, and what the last year has been like. And I just wanted to share what we're looking at over the next year. Like I said, we're expanding our building safety team with new roles to support addressing these actions, and to provide that further support to those working in our specialised housing buildings. We're developing a Green Square Accord strategy, so that further alignment of all those background bits and pieces is continuing, particularly in the areas of systems that we're using. Really cracking on with those risk assessed programmes of work. And one of the big things we're doing is looking at ways we can make sure that our fire risk assessments are shared, and that fire safety data and information with our partners, care providers, our occupiers and our customers. And that's our ideal, that's what we want to do, but it needs some we need to be able to do it well in a way that our customers will be able to understand it. So we're looking at different languages and things like that we have to consider, and how we share it and how we record we're sharing it, really. So yeah, that's me.
Oh, what a comprehensive overview. And I'm sure everybody's listening and watching, gasping at how on earth have you managed to do that all of the year, having joined. But I'm sure you and the team have sort of worked tirelessly around this. I'm going to invite everybody to join us. I'm sure many of the things you've covered are pick up from what Justin kicked off with, what Emma sort of talked about in terms of Ongo and John in relation to Metropolitan, but also Carl has joined us. I'm really delighted that Carl Sherwood has joined us from DLUG. And before I sort of open up, we've had about 8 or 9 questions. Before I do so, in the next sort of 10 minutes, I just wonder if Carl, if you're there, and whether I could introduce you, if you'd like to say a few words both about yourself and your role within DLUG, but also any observations or comments from what you've heard from the speakers.
Certainly. Hi all. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm not sure if my camera's working.
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thank you for the invite today. It's really nice to see actually all this come together in the sharing of knowledge. I work in the technical policy division within the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, shortened to DLUG. And we're covering a number of different research work streams at the moment, looking at different parts of approved document B, so the fire safety guidance for the building regulations. And certainly we've heard a lot of calls, and we've had a lot of evidence around fire safety in these types of buildings, and it's quite striking how complex the issues are, how many different issues there are, the unique sort of role these buildings play, both in their sort of their management, but also the role in society as well. There's a great societal value around these types of buildings, and there's a great importance on keeping people in them safe. So we're very interested to hear of some of the findings that some of the speakers have been presenting today. Our research is ongoing at the moment, and it will be nice at some point in the future, perhaps if we can come back and feed back some of those findings to yourselves as well, and what that might mean for future policy and policy options when the ministers make their decisions. So yeah, thank you once again for the invite, and I'll be here for Q&A as well.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I'm glad you had an opportunity also to listen to some of the sort of real life examples. And you may have missed Justin's opening presentation, which they set out some of the sort of broader guidance as well. But you'll be familiar with all that, I'm sure. Let me just kick off. I mean, I've got about 9 or so questions. Justin, I know you've answered a few. I mean, there's some which relate to each of your presentations, but I think I'll kick off with one which I saw earlier, which was very much one about fire blankets. What are the mindsets on these? Want to promote evacuation and not firefighting in our supported living schemes. We provide them, but looking to remove them. Any comments about that from Katie? Does anybody have any views on that?
We at OnGo had a spate of doing exactly what they're speaking about removing them, because we didn't want to promote firefighting and everything else. And then following removing them all, the next fire risk assessment that was done suggested we put them all back in again. So it really is kind of, we've been speaking about grey areas today. It is a bit of a grey area, and it kind of, if you're not going to have them, and they've been recommended by a fire risk assessment, all I can say is you need to have your justification why you've removed them all, and obviously have that written into your kind of policies and procedures that you won't provide fire blankets and why you won't provide them. The kind of comment I got from my fire risk assessors were, because I've had these discussions with them, was wouldn't it be a shame for a full building to burn down if you'd have just put a fire blanket over it, and that would have suffocated the fire, but because you hadn't provided that, it turned into a much more serious incident. And that was kind of the thinking around the fire risk assessors for asking them to be in all kind of drink making areas and kitchens and things like that, that for a small pan fire, it could obviously be put out very quickly, even though we're not promoting firefighting as such. And that was kind of the thought process I've been taken down by my fire risk assessors.
And it might,
sorry,
it might be helpful for me to share. We've got
please.
some assured advice through our primary authority scheme with regards to fire extinguishers and fire extinguisher media, and I think there's varying different approaches to it. I've got a personal opinion on it, which I'm happy to share, but I think for us, it depends on the occupancy, it depends on the building, it depends on your evacuation strategy, and that's not the same consistently throughout specialised housing in general. It's quite different in a sheltered scheme as it is to a very small supported scheme. But our stance is that, exactly as Emma's just said, part of the training that's given in the practical use of fire blankets and fire extinguishers is when to not fight a fire. So by providing that training, you're getting that confirmation of, no, we won't fight anything larger than a waste paper basket, we'll turn our back on it and evacuate. So for me, also getting that positive no, and not having staff that might attempt to fight a fire by other means or inappropriately, because they've not had that training, it is an equal risk. So we'll provide the training and provide the equipment.
Thanks for that. Let's move on. We've got quite a few, and I'm conscious we're sort of rapidly running out of time. Laura asks about carbon monoxide alarms, and research suggests with people with dementia maybe elevated risk. Any thoughts about that, either of you, or John, or indeed Justin?
I can answer why there isn't any in my OS, for example, in a dementia scheme, because the only place that gas goes into in the dementia scheme is the plant room, and then the hot water and heating is distributed by heat interface units, and usage is monitored by meter, obviously. So there is no gas appliances within the apartments or communal areas. So that's why that wasn't considered as part of that bill, because it was already considered and decided that that would be taken away as an issue, if that helps anybody.
Thanks. And Laura's just put thanks for the clarification. And Nigel asks about, I think this is also for you, Emma, was a fire consultant appointed to advise on the fire design? Was this down to the architect, design team, contractor? If so, who appointed the consultant?
Right, so I can't 100% answer that question. However, obviously I'll be speaking to Jeremy and Sally afterwards, and if you want to leave your contact details, I'll certainly get the team that ran the project to confirm how that was decided at the start. This kind of fed into what I was saying about getting all your teams involved, because what happens is the project is done and your building compliance team sometimes get involved quite far down the line, and then obviously they would have known all this at the start and been able to feed into what they needed from the end of it and things. So if you want to send your details via HousingLIN, then obviously I will forward that onto the team that did it, and they would be happy to discuss that with you, I'm sure.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure we can arrange that as well. Look, I'm conscious we got a few more questions in the Q&A box, and also Emily has just posted something into the chat box, which she couldn't get it into the Q&A box, and it's really around the role of OTs. And in fact, there's been quite a lot of discussions around the role of OTs in the chat box. I don't know if you've seen that. Any thoughts about that, about how to engage and involve OTs, how to ensure properties are compliant to wheelchair accessibility rather than just wheelchair adaptable, and how that links into fire risk assessments from anybody?
Helen,
kick off.
Yeah, I can chip in. So for us, it tends to come more so out of the back of the person-centred fire risk assessment approaches rather than the overall fire risk assessments. And actually, we have had some, I can share experiences really of where we thought we were making a building safer off of the back of a fire risk assessment recommendation, and for example change locks, that then has gone on to present issues for some of our customers that have been picked up in person-centred fire risk assessments. And where I'm going with this is when we get an outcome out of a person-centred fire risk assessment, and changes need to be made, then at that point connection with OT is made, and I think we could make it earlier and consider it before. It would have been much better before we changed all of the locks to make those connections. So I think that's something that needs to link between the fire risk assessment and the person-centred fire risk assessment process.
Well, thanks for that. A couple of final questions. I'm afraid we'll have to draw it to a close. One from Algazata. I hope I've pronounced your name right. What expectations will be on the care provider around the fire safety in the scheme? What's stay put policy mean for the care provider in the scheme? I don't know if that's something for you, Helen, or indeed John, because you talked about those relationships with care providers as well.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's a case-by-case basis, depending on your fire strategy and the overall evacuation plan. The only real bit of concrete guidance or legislation you have to go through with that is that you must work together. So that's essentially the only statutory framework for the role of the different parties in that building. So kind of back to a lot of what we've been talking about, and particularly what Emma and Helen were saying around that practical relationship. It's just about being as joined up as possible and having in particular a really clear shared understanding of everyone's role and responsibilities, whatever you decide those are. Like ultimately, I think it can feel quite difficult often for a care provider to be having a conversation or to have a conversation with the care provider about their role in a fire situation, an evacuation situation. I can say this also with a care provider hat on as well, not just landlord.
Of course.
But fundamentally, you're there much more as a care provider. In most of these kind of services, you'll be there 24/7. It is sensible that you take on some active role in that. And on my own experience, if something happens, the colleagues based on site will more often than not look to do something. And I would much rather they look to do something that has been defined and agreed and worked out than go, oh, there's a fire alarm. I think I'm meant to leave, but so-and-so's over there, I'm going to go and get them, and make it up as you go. So I think it's just about being really sensible and practical in each situation and having those really open, clear discussions. And if there's any confusion, like being clear on the documentation, because from a slightly kind of, less positive frame of mind, if you do need to evidence any of that at that point, or if that relationship does feel strange, you need to be really clear on what those agreed positions were and the steps you've taken, whichever side of that relationship you're on.
Thank you. And I'm going to just touch on this last question, which is from Claire Jolly. Talks about a scheme they've got with people with varying needs. But I think the key thing she's asking really is about that sort of staying put policy or not, of what the expectations are of staff to firefight. And she says, we're currently faced with the question of where we stand with those tenants who've deteriorated or are bedbound. These tenants will not be able to evacuate their flat in the event that a fire starts in their own flat. What can we do to safeguard these tenants? And I'll ask everyone just to come back on that.
I mean, I'm happy to start if that's all right. I mean,
Yeah,
it's kind of that, I think that's fundamentally the kind of the point I was getting to at the end of that final slide on my point is, it's the big question in all of this. So making some assumptions, those people are probably on tenancies that mean you aren't able to turn around and say this just isn't suitable for you anymore. And I suspect a lot of us wouldn't want to do that, even if we had the legal route with which to do it. Obviously, practically, you've got PEEPs and personal FRAs. They need to be in place. That's your kind of standard structured way of working some of that out. But yeah, fundamentally, that is one of the biggest challenges we have, because on a stay put policy, you can reasonably work out your mitigations. You can think about horizontal moves, some of what Justin was talking about. There's role for the team that you've got on site, whether they're care, housing or anyone else. There's a lot of things you can think through there, because you're only ever really talking about one household at a time that you might be wishing to evacuate. And yes, that can grow, but ultimately that one moment before you've got the expectation of a fire and rescue service on site, it's very limited and it's much more manageable. The challenge is then when you flip that over to simultaneous evacuation, it becomes a very different question, and often there's very little you can do that removes that risk. So you just have to really think through every bit of mitigation you can put in place. And I think it's really just about coming back to what's practical and what's reasonable. So you can't be expected to change someone's physical needs and their ability to evacuate. You can't potentially be expected to completely rebuild a building and change the way it's been designed in order to accommodate that. But there are things you could be expected to do. So looking at smaller mitigations you can put in place. Have we reduced the risk of fire as much as possible? Are we confident in the speed at which the alarm is raised? All of those kind of things. So that would be my thoughts on that point. But yeah, it's the tough question in all of this.
Yeah, no, perhaps we shouldn't have left it till last. Emma, any final thoughts? And then I'll go to Helen and then Justin and ask Carl for any final thoughts too.
My final thoughts, really, a lot of this, and it's been echoed by everybody else on here today, is it's about the building the relationships and getting everybody to understand the part they play in this. And it's all the way from the top, top down. So even from building design, and obviously this is the building safety crisis that we're facing at the moment, obviously. It's just got to be considered all the way through, and even through to teams that don't feel that they have any effect on these kind of things, that they actually do, and the training to be there and know what to report and who to report it to. And it's just about everything being really, I think, open and transparent with everybody who's involved in it, so that there isn't any confusion and it is managed how it needs to be managed for the benefit ultimately of the people that live there, to ensure that they are safe, because that is what everybody ultimately wants and needs to achieve.
Helen?
I'd echo those comments, really. I think for us as well, communication is one of our biggest things, all the way from developers, risk assessors, but through to all the different colleagues that have something within Green Square Accord and our own organisations and other organisations involved in the safety of those buildings. And it's an active conversation, isn't it? I think a lot of people are in the same boat, waiting for outcomes of certain things. So.
Yes, and I was also struck by what you were talking about, the diversity of your customer base as well, not just your professional customer, but your residents as well. So again, to think about the language, the culture, etc., etc. Justin, can you hear us? Okay, have you got any final comments?
I can. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm thinking. I mean, it's all very similar vein, really, but it's that kind of collaboration pulled forward. Which is currently kind of you sit in the back end and the front end, and pulling that all together right early on, so that you can actually avoid these risks in the first place, and really cover as many of your bases at the beginning so that you don't need to worry about them later on, because you've got the built-in flexibility to deal with a variety of issues and risks already. You don't have a thin sort of proposal that blows over, you know, very quickly. That's for me. It's that getting it to the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you. And Carl, any concluding comments?
Yeah, certainly. It's striking how linked the building design construction is to the underpinning management and residents within the building, and I think I'll echo the thoughts of the other speakers in that considering those in the whole is of critical importance. Certainly from a regulator's point of view, you know, ADB covers the design aspects and guidance around the building layout, but they've got to be underpinned by realistic expectations of management, and that's where the fire safety order comes in. So I don't think these two issues can be thought about separately. It has to be looked at in each individual instance, considering the building, the proposed residency, the expectations around management to form that effective fire strategy.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, and you also said earlier it'd be something you'd like to come back to with either this session or broadly, and we'd be delighted to host a happy hour. What you may not have known because you joined slightly late, this is the most popular happy hour session we've ever run. We had over 300 people sign up to it. So can I thank all of you for your excellent presentations. It was really seamless, and I think, you know, the comments we've had both in the chat box and the Q&As have been very well received. If people are interested in speaking at a future happy hour, do email us. We're really keen to hear about other subjects and topic matters. You need to beat this one though. They've laid down a really high bar. And also, if you would like to write a blog or share a case study with us or any thought leadership, do let us know. We're really always looking out for innovative and informative new examples of practice. Do also engage with our team about any activities you'd like more support with in your own organisations, and the link to our website is there. I just want to thank again everybody for your afternoon, for joining us. We've had over 100 people stayed on right to the end. Thanks ever so for your presentations. We very much look forward to seeing you all at our next happy hour session, which is on the 26th of April, which is looking at some of the innovations happening in Scotland more generally around housing for older people. So if you are interested in that subject, please do register with us again, and do look out later this week for our May happy hour sessions. We've got an exciting programme to build on today's for you. So thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing you at a future session.
Bye.